Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Sunday morning Parsha class, the Parsha of Boy, the third Parsha in the book of Shmois, in the book of Exodus, second book of the Torah. We continue with the story of the Jewish people in the in Egypt, the oppression, the slavery in Egypt under Pharaoh. And already last week, we started introducing 7 of the 10 plagues that were brought about to the Egyptians in Egypt. And this week's Parsha, we continue with the next 3, the final 3 plagues. And we have the actual exodus of Egypt, where the Jewish people became a nation and not just a family, and we leave Egypt, and then in next week's parsha, we have the splitting of the sea, which leads us to the next parsha, where we actually receive the Torah on Mount Sinai. So this is really, really a very essential story and parsha of the Torah. Every parsha of the Torah is essential, but the idea of the Exodus of Egypt is so central to our Judaism, as we see so many times in our prayer and so many mitzvahs that we do that mention the idea that we're leaving Egypt. So I want to talk a little bit after the next 2 plagues, which was the plague of grasshoppers, locusts, and we have the plague of darkness. The final plague is the death of the first child, the firstborn, the Bechor, Makas Bechoros. We know Pharaoh himself was the firstborn, and this was perhaps the only plague which was actually killing the Egyptian. It wasn't just torturing them, right? Having blood instead of water is uncomfortable. Having frogs in your food is uncomfortable. But the death of the firstborn was the worst, was the most severe type of plague. And there was a lot of warning before and a lot of preparation on the Jewish people's part, because they realized that this is the final one. After this, they're leaving. They realized that this is it. And God got them prepared. And part of this preparation was the Jewish people had to bring the Paschal lamb as an offering to God. And the Torah dedicates quite a few verses in this week's Parsha talking about this idea, this mitzvah. The idea of a mezuzah, as we have today, is already mentioned or hinted to in this week's Parsha, although it's mentioned clearly later. But the idea that they had to take the blood and put it on the post, that God should know, or the angel should know, that to differentiate between the house of a Jew and the house of the Egyptian, that's already in this week's Parsha. They're having a marker on our door to know that this is a Jewish home. The concept is already in this week's Parsha. After at midnight, the plague takes effect, and the Pharaoh comes running out trying to look for Moshe and Aaron. Said, "Please, just go. You just go. We had enough of this." And the next morning, right in the middle, smack in the middle of the day, God did not want them to leave in the middle of the night. That were sneaking out. God wanted them to be right in the open with all the press and everything. Jewish people are leaving Egypt, with an outstretched arm, proudly, and they all leave Egypt right in the middle of the day. And we know that what the day was. The day was the 15th of Nisan. Bless you. Until today, we celebrate that exact day, the day of Passover. Every year is the exact same day, the 15th of Nisan. Whether it comes early, whether it comes late, and we'll talk about that in a moment, the Jewish calendar. But that's in this week's Parsha. Jewish people leave, and of course, the next week's Parsha continues where we left off, where this Parsha leaves off, where a few days later, Pharaoh has a change of heart and goes chasing the Jewish people. But I want to read just a few verses in the beginning of chapter 12, where when God introduces this commandment, this mitzvah of the Paschal lamb, in order to introduce this mitzvah, the Torah first gives us another more general mitzvah, which is the mitzvah of the calendar, right? If God tells us, many of our mitzvahs are very dependent on time. On this day, do this, right? Our holidays are that way, right? So, as a prerequisite to any other mitzvah that's on a calendar, you have to have a calendar. So the first mitzvah that we are given is the mitzvah of a calendar, the Jewish calendar. And we know that the Jewish calendar is unique, it's different. And it's so important that going back all the way to the beginning of the Torah, the first Rashi, the commentator Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, French rabbi in 11th century, I believe, he wrote, we study Rashi all the time, right? We don't study Torah without Rashi. He writes right at the beginning that the Torah seemingly should have begun not with the entire book of Genesis, the entire story of creation and Adam and Eve and and our matriarchs and our patriarchs, that whole story of how the Jewish people came about, that should have been secondary. The beginning of the Torah really should have been with this chapter 12, which is the first mitzvah. Because ultimately, the Torah is a guide. It's a guide to life. It's a book of laws. How do we live our life? So the first chapter should be the first mitzvah, HaChodesh. Like we'll see, we'll read momentarily. And Rashi has to explain what is the reason why we begin with Bereshis. And Rashi says, a different explanation, that Torah wanted to tell us that ultimately God is in charge and God created the world, and and Israel really belongs to the Jewish people because God decided to give it to them, which is a whole topic for itself. But the point is, there's a reason why the Torah didn't start with this. But Rashi says that if not for that reason, really the Torah should have began with this verse that we'll read right now. It's the first mitzvah. It's the first mitzvah that we have received as a nation. So we're on page 406, 407, chapter 12, verse 1. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe el Aharon. God spoke to Moshe and to Aaron. Even though generally in the Torah, when God speaks to Moshe, God speaks to us about the mitzvahs, he speaks to Moshe alone. But there are numerous times that Aaron was included in this revelation of God. And over here, this is one of those times because Aaron was so involved, as we spoke last week, in the miracles and the plagues and speaking to Pharaoh. So therefore, he was included as well in this commandment of the first mitzvah and the commandment of the Paschal Lamb. And where was this said? Be'eretz Mitzrayim. This was in the land of Mitzrayim. And right away, Rashi is uncomfortable with saying that this was actually the land of Mitzrayim because, first of all, why is the Torah emphasizing that? We know where they are. They are in Egypt. Because generally, when Moshe spoke to God, Moshe did not speak from the city of Egypt alone, or the city of Cairo, or the city of where people were living in Egypt, because it was full of idol worshippers and idols. So he would always leave the city. So Rashi comments right away that when it says that God spoke to them in the land of Egypt, it means outside of the city in the land of Egypt. Okay. What does he say? Verse 2, HaChodesh hazeh lachem, this month shall be to you Rosh Chodashim, the head of the months. Rishon hu lachem, it is the first for you, the Chodshe Hashana, for the months of the year. Very, very simply put, when we count months, how do we count months? If I tell you that we are currently in the 8th month, or the 2nd month, or the 5th month, what month is that? The Torah very often will reference months by the number of the month. On the 7th month, on the first of the 7th month, you should blow the shofar, right? So what's the 7th month?
Letters of the alphabet.
So every letter of the alphabet has a numerical value.
Right.
The question is, when we count it, there's 12 months of the year, where do we start counting? So we start counting from the month of Passover, which is the month of Nisan, or there's a name to it. The names were given later. Perhaps only, during the second temple era after the first exile. But what we call today Nisan, which is the month of Passover, that's the first month of counting months, right? So it's a little complicated, right? So when we count years, we count from Tishrei, which is the high holidays. Rosh Hashanah is the first day of the year, right? So when we count years, we count through Tishrei. When we count months, we count from Nisan, from Passover. Like they say, if you ever want to be famished, you start figuring out the months of the year on the Jewish calendar. It's very complicated. But the point is that when we count years, we count from Tishrei, which is the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, right? Sukkot. That's the beginning of the new year, right? When are you writing your New Year cards? When are you getting when are we eating your apple and honey and saying Shana Tova Umatuka, we should have a good and sweet new year? That's Tishrei. That's the 7th month of the year. The Torah says the 7th month of the year is the new year, right? So it's like, but when we count months, we count from Nisan. But truthfully, this verse is really understood as a much broader sense. It wasn't just telling us to count months from Nisan, but it was also telling us that we have months. What's a month? What's the makeup of a month?
30 days.
30 days. Is that arbitrary? Just 30 days? Why not? Why not 40 days? Why not 25 days? Yeah. 31, okay. Cycle of a moon, exactly, right? So when it comes to time, there's different cycles of time, right? We have 24 hours in a day. We have 7 days in a week. We have roughly 30 days in a month. We have how many days in the year? Okay, we'll go with that for now. 365 days in a year, right? What makes these cycles a cycle, right? So we'll start with days, right? What makes a 24-hour day? Because the cycle of
Hours of time, evening and sun.
the sun, the day, right? The day, night, and the day is 24 hours, whether it's a longer day and a shorter night or a longer night and a shorter day, right? But ultimately, 24 hours later, you're pretty much at the same point where you were 24 hours ago. So that's the cycle of the day. So there is how do you say it?
It's a lunar calendar.
That's not lunar, that's solar.
No,
Days.
the month, the year, I mean.
Now, the cycle of the month, the cycle of the week is arbitrary. There's nothing, well, astronomical, thank you.
Yeah.
The cycle of the week from an astronomical standpoint, I believe, is arbitrary because nothing happens every 7 days. Astrology is not the same as astronomy. Right. So astrology is understanding that there is an effect that the planets have on the world. Astronomy is just understanding what the cycle of the planets. So every week, nothing really is happening, right? We just count 7 days, right? And that's why, like in Russia during communism, they had a 5-day week, right? It was just, why not? Let's do a 5-day week, which made it very difficult for Jewish people who were trying to keep Shabbos,
Right.
where sometimes the day off was just happened to be Shabbos every so many weeks. But otherwise, it was a 5-day week, right? Maybe even some societies till today have that. Why 7 days? So obviously, from a Jewish standpoint, the answer is why 7 days? Because that's going back to creation, right? God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. That made that 7-day cycle. But I don't think there's perhaps other explanations for why we have a 7-day week, but that's the reason that we obviously understand why it's 7 days. Now, the cycle of the month, the 30-day cycle, is what, like Lewis said, it's the cycle of the month of the moon, and that's why it's called a month. What's a month? It's the cycle of a moon, right? It's the new moon. It's a 30-day cycle, roughly. It's not exactly a 30-day cycle. It's actually a 29.5-day cycle, but we go with 30. And that's why in the Jewish calendar, sometimes we have a 29-day month. Some days we have a 30-day month because it's really 29 and a half plus a little bit of an actual lunar cycle. So that's what a month is. There is nothing happens. There's no solar monthly cycle. The sun doesn't have a monthly cycle. So that's why. Okay, so that's month. Then we have year. What's the cycle of a year? Jill says that a year is 365 days. That is correct. The cycle of the sun is 365 plus a little bit. So 365 is the cycle of the sun. The lunar cycle, the moon's cycle, is a monthly cycle, right? So if you count 12 lunar cycles, you're going to come to 355 or 354 days. So you're actually 11 days short. The lunar cycle and the solar cycle are actually 11 days apart. So there's no monthly cycle for the sun, and there's no yearly cycle for the moon. But if you want to take a solar year, instead of counting 365 days, we want to break it up in months. So you break 365 in 12. What are you going to get? You're going to get 30 or 31, right? Because it's just arbitrary. You just want to have a year in 12, split in 12. If you take 12 lunar cycles, you get 354. So that's the lunar cycle. That's why if you follow lunar calendar, you're always going to fall behind, right? Some years we say it's an early, Pesach is early, Pesach is late, Hanukkah is early. This year Hanukkah was very late, right? Hanukkah is well into January, right? Or end of December, January. It's so late. Why is it so late? Because every year you lose 11 days. Now you have two options. One option is to stick with it, like the Muslim, like Islam also follows a lunar calendar, but they follow a strictly lunar calendar. So every year their calendar falls 11 days behind the Gregorian calendar, solar calendar, and therefore think about, let's say, Ramadan, right? When is Ramadan? Well, every year it's 11 days. It begins 11 days before last year's, and therefore every number of years, it could be in the summer, it could be in the winter. They don't follow the seasons. So seasons are a solar cycle, right? So it's just lunar. They just follow strictly lunar. The Torah gives us something very interesting. The Torah tells us, "Hachodesh hazeh lachem," count the months. So by definition, if you're counting the month, you're counting it by the moon. And in fact, we're told that we say Hachodesh hazeh, this month, that God was actually pointing to the moon. And he say, look, you see the birth of the new moon? Because the moon, right, every 30 days gets reborn, because at the 15th day it's at its full its glory, right? The reflection of the sun is on the full half, where we're able to see the full half. And then as the month goes on, it shifts, where the sun is shining on the half where is less and less seen from planet Earth. And therefore it comes to a point on the 29th day of the month where you don't see the moon. Or the 30th day of the month, you don't see the moon at all, because the sun is reflecting light on this part of the moon that we can't see from our standpoint. So it's like there's no moon. You don't see it. And then on the first day of the month, boom, there's the birth of the moon. Now we start seeing a little sliver of the new moon. So it's the birth of the new moon. So God pointed to the moon and told Moshe, look, this is Rosh Chodesh. This is the new month. And this is how you should sanctify the month, right? So he told Moshe, we're following the months. But at the same time, we are told, I don't think it's in this week's Parsha, but later on when we're told about the mitzvah of Passover every year, we say that it should always be b'chodesh ha'aviv. It always has to be in the spring. So he connects Passover to a season, the spring, which the spring is obviously a solar cycle, right? But it tells us that we counted on the 15th day of the month of Nisan, which is a lunar calendar, right? But they don't coincide. Every year, if we just follow the months, every year Pesach is going to be 11 days earlier than last year. So it's not going to be in the spring. It may be in the winter. And then a few years later, it may be in the summer. And a few years later, it'll be back in the spring, right? It's not going to stay in the same season. So that's why we have what's called leap years. What's a leap year? Leap year is when we add an extra year, right? Extra month, right? You have a leap year where you add an extra day in February every 4 years. But in Jewish calendar, a leap year is actually we add a complete new month and it happens to be, it's always the month of Adar, the second Adar, right? That's because we add 30 days every 2 or 3 years when we fall behind. So it's 11, 22 days behind, or sometimes 33 days behind, and we add 30 days. But so sometimes we go ahead, sometimes we can fall behind. So like this, we're always back and forth. It's a 19-year cycle. Every 19 years, the two calendars align once again. How do I know this? Well, I know this because I studied it, but it happens to be that I just turned 38. And so my birthday, twice 19, my English birthday and my Hebrew birthday were on the same day once again, right? Because it takes every 19 years. So that's that.
Strange how it's the birth of a new moon, but yet the moon is still there. It hasn't gone anywhere.
Right, it's a birth
just
of
the
a
birth of
right.
sight of the moon.
Exactly. Now, so the verse, the next verse continues talking about what to do on the 10th day of the month, which right away, only after we're able to tell you that we follow the months. Now I can tell you, okay, in 10 days, the 10th day of the month, they have to take a lamb, they tie it to the bedpost, and eventually bring it as a sacrifice. This is something that the Egyptians they worshipped the animals, and therefore they were not very happy for the fact that they're taking an animal for a sacrifice, and that caused itself a whole uproar amongst the Egyptians, which ended up being a big miracle for the Jewish people, which is a story for itself, why the Shabbos before Passover, we refer to it as Shabbat HaGadol, the big Shabbos. And one of the explanations behind it is because such a big miracle happened to the Jewish people even before the exodus of Egypt in relation to this story over here. But going back to this mitzvah, the mitzvah of the calendar, the lunar calendar, and like Rashi says, this is really the first mitzvah. It's the first mitzvah that we're given. The first is so special. It's special to be the first. You go into a new business or an old business, and you see on the wall the dollar bills hanging on the wall. This is my first transaction, my first sale. Oh, it's something special, right? An author writing a book puts a lot of time and thought into the opening of the book. What is the first words going to be? How am I starting the book, right? The opening, the start is something very important. And the same is true with the Torah. Although every letter in the Torah is exact and important and significant, has so much meaning behind it, but the first is always special. So, we're sitting around the table, we're having a meeting, and God says, okay, what do we say? We're the committee over here. We're writing out the Torah. What should be the first mitzvah? What should be the first mitzvah? What's the most important mitzvah? I mean, there's so many mitzvahs, right? Which one is the most important? Who would have thought, oh, the calendar. The fact that we have a lunar calendar, that should be the first mitzvah. What's the significance of this mitzvah?
It ties in everything.
Ties in everything. So, by the way, the mitzvah itself is not only to follow the lunar calendar, but also to sanctify the new moon, which was a whole process where God wanted that we shouldn't just study astronomy and know the cycle of the moon and therefore just follow that calendar, but we should actually actively every month sanctify the new moon. And there's a whole process where there were witnesses, where people would stand outside and look for the new moon. Do I see the new moon? It's new to our perspective, obviously, but are we able to see the moon? And if we're able to see the moon, they would go to Jerusalem and go to the Beis Din in Jerusalem, and they used to testify, we saw the new moon. And then the rabbis, they would study astronomy, and they knew whether it was possible that tonight would be the new moon. And then they would ask them questions, and then if they realize that they're saying the truth, then they would say, okay, Mikudash, that today is sanctified as Rosh Chodesh, right? So they would decide when was the Rosh Chodesh, because like we said, it's 29 and a half days. So is it going to be a 29-day month, or is it going to be a 30-day month? When is the new moon going to appear? Today we have a calendar, but back in the day they didn't have a calendar. It was a month by month. And if you want to schedule, so just yesterday, last week, someone calls me and says, I'm scheduling my wedding for August 2026. I said, wait, 2026 is 2020. No, 2026. So it's a year and a half from now. Said, yeah, we're in school, we're this and that. August 2026, we're confirming with the hall. We just want to make sure it works, on the Jewish calendar, it's a good day, right? Great, no problem. I ended up convincing him to do it a year earlier. So he's getting married in 2025. But we schedule things way in ahead, right? We're like doing things. We schedule things 5 years. Back in the day, there was no calendar. You could the most you could do, I could schedule something up to 30 days. You want an eye exam? If it comes to my office, after 30 days, you got to call again because we don't have a calendar. We don't know anything, right? We don't know when the holidays are going to be. When is Pesach this year? I don't know. We'll find out 2 weeks before. We'll find out when Rosh Chodesh is, when's the first day of the month, and then we'll know when Passover is. Right? So it was a month by month basis. Because every month could have been a 29-day month or a 30-day month. They wouldn't tell you in advance. And they weren't able to tell you because no one knew. It was really dependent on whether the two witnesses would have seen the birth of the new moon. And if there wasn't, it would have been a 30-day month. If they were, then it was a 29-day month. And when would they find out? On that day. Right? It's living in the moment.
Yeah.
Living in the moment, right? But it's very hard to schedule things, right? Because sometimes they didn't have, radios. They didn't have, WhatsApp groups. And the shul said, okay, Rabbi Nemes decided that today's Rosh Chodesh. That's it. We have our calendar for the month. How are you supposed to find these things out? Send letters. It takes time to travel, right? So they had different methods. At one point, they had this method where they would have people standing on these tall mountains all over Israel, one after another. Each mountain was able to see the other mountain, and the closest mountain to Jerusalem would get the message. Okay, tonight's Rosh Chodesh. So he would take this big torch, and he would stand on this tall mountain, and he would wave the torch, and that was a sign. Everyone knew. If you see the torch, you knew tonight's Rosh Chodesh. Now, the guy standing on the next mountain, a mile away, saw the guy doing the torch, and he would put his torch up, and then the guy a mile away. So like this, within minutes, all of Israel knew that today's Rosh Chodesh because in every area there was a guy on a tall mountain waving a torch. And like this, it spread like wildfire, right? It spread quickly throughout Israel. What was the problem with that? The problem with that, what happens if you have a little kid and says, you know what? I'm going to go up there, but a lot of fun. Start waving a torch, right? So people started messing around with the system. Some people did it deliberately because they didn't. A lot of controversy with the Jewish people then. So people were actually going just to mess things up, and they realized, you know what? We need to have certified. You need to get a certified confirmation from the Beit Din that today's Rosh Chodesh. So they actually had to send out messengers. They had people on horses to go travel to every community and let them know when Rosh Chodesh is. The problem is some people live far. So people in Israel itself pretty much all got that information within 2 weeks. It took about 2 weeks to get to the furthest part in Israel. But people in the diaspora, people who are living outside of Israel, it took more than 2 weeks. What's the problem with more than 2 weeks? Because the holidays are in 2 weeks. Pesach is the 15th day of the month. It's 2 weeks into the month. Sukkot is 2 weeks into the month, right? Shavuos is not a problem because Shavuos is actually 50 days since Pesach, so that's not a problem. You just count 50 days. But so what would they do? That's the reason why they would keep 2-day holidays. Right? That's the reason why in the diaspora we have a 2-day holiday, because they didn't know what day was Rosh Chodesh till after the holiday. So they weren't sure, is it the 15th or is it the 14th? Is it the 15th or is it the 16th? So they would just keep both days, just in case.
Why don't now that it's modern, when couldn't they change it back just like they changed it before? Why can't they change it now?
But no fun.
I read that they found that in some synagogues, like old synagogue, I'm talking about really old, they found these big holes in the ground they were studying it, they found out that what these rabbis would do is they would fill the holes up with water. And then the water would reflect the stars. And then they would stick sticks in the puddle to where the reflection of the star was, and that's how they would keep track
Interesting.
astronomically of
Very
what's
interesting.
what's where.
The mission, that's interesting. The mission does say that Rabbi Gamliel had this big, all these charts on his wall, and he was an expert knowing about, with the star, with the stars and with the moon.
It almost had
exactly.
to be to keep
Yeah,
track of.
yeah. I mean, just the fact that the Mishnah tells us the exact cycle of the moon, 29 and a half days, and this so many hours and minutes and seconds. This is before it was before anything, right? But this is before NASA, before any scientific. This was the Torah in its wisdom told us the exact cycle. But going back to where was I before this?
Before.
Oh, that's why we have a second day, right? The second day of the holiday, because they didn't know exactly when it was. The idea is that the Torah specifically. Oh, your question. I'm sorry. So Jill had the question. Thank you. Why don't we go back to where it was before? Now that we have a calendar, and just to tell you, the development of the calendar happened basically. The Torah says that the Beis Din, which have smicha, which is not any Beis Din today, but it says Beis Din that was ordained by people who were ordained, going back to Moshe, they have to be the one to sanctify the month. So it was actually quite a while after the destruction of the second temple where they were still continuing doing this, but then it got, when the Jewish people started going into the diaspora, and it was so splintered, and so then they realized it's just the best way to do this is to stop doing this method of every month by month, because it wasn't spreading and it wasn't uniform, because different communities were having different calendars. It was getting very messy. So then there was a man by the name of Hillel, who, not the famous Hillel, but a different Hillel, who set up the calendar as we have it today. And if you read Maimonides, he dedicates about 7 or 8 chapters just to understand how we built this calendar, which is a fascinating study. But today we have a universal calendar. All Jewish people follow the same calendar, where pretty much every other month it's 29 days, 30 days, 29 days, 30 days, to kind of keep the balance. But because it's not exactly 29 and a half days, so therefore 2 months of the year, every year is different. Some years they're both 30, some years they're both 29, some years one is 29, one is 30. So between whatever, it kind of evens itself out. And that's basically the Jewish calendar, which is accepted today. Jill's question is, well, now that we have a calendar, so let's go back to the one day holiday method, which is biblical, right? The Torah, and it's the way it's done in Israel. Why do we hold on to the 2-day holiday?
Still don't have it exact, we're still playing with the half a day.
So we still don't have it. We don't have an exact, but we do have an exact calendar, meaning the calendar does tell us exactly which day is the 15th day of the month, right? Originally, the reason why they had 2 days is because they didn't know. They came the 14th, we're like, is it the 14th or is it the 15th? We didn't know. So out of doubt, we just kept 2 days of holiday, just in case. But now that we know, the calendar takes that into consideration. The calendar takes into consideration the 29 and a half plus, so therefore 1 month is like this, 1 month is like that. It's all mathematically figured out in the calendar. But now that we have a calendar and it's accepted, right? Everyone accepts the Jewish calendar. Why don't we go back to that method? And the reason for this is because you have to understand that for this method, this idea that the diaspora communities were keeping a 2-day holiday, it wasn't just a few years. It was hundreds of years that they were keeping the 2-day. It was hundreds of years. So there's this concept where when something became like an established custom, it already becomes binding. Now, this is already the law, right?
It's the law or it's this tradition?
It's the rabbinic law. So the rabbis decided that because there's so many hundreds of years, for generations, this is what we were doing in the diaspora. So even after we got the calendar, they said we're making a calendar, but we're still keeping on to this custom, and it became now rabbinic law to keep the second day of holiday. So it's the first day is biblical, the second day is rabbinic, right? So like Passover, the first night of Hanukkah, the first night of Passover to eat the matzah is biblical. The second night is rabbinic. Now, there are very few ramifications, whether it's rabbinic or biblical. We consider both of them biblical because the Torah tells us to follow rabbinic law, right? So, so there are few differences. There are some leniencies, the second night, because it's only rabbinic, but for the most part, you keep it the same. The rabbis, cover them for themselves, right? But there is a verse clearly in the Torah to follow what the sages teach us, right? Okay. So we understand who mentioned Lewis, how the calendar is so essential because everything is built on the calendar, right? So if I'm going to tell you a mitzvah, blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, or when is Rosh Hashanah? Well, I have to have a calendar to know when Rosh Hashanah is. So technically, it's very important. It's a foundation to everything else. But there's obviously greater significance to this mitzvah of the calendar, the mitzvah, the fact that we follow the lunar calendar, the fact that the lunar calendar is not just run by a calendar as we have it today, but originally it was meant to be where the people basically decide when Rosh Chodesh will be, when we have almost like a control over the calendar, that when we see the moon, that is when Rosh Chodesh is. This is there's significance to this mitzvah of the calendar. In fact, I once heard that in Russia, communism that was trying to ban some of the Jewish rituals and practices, one of the first things that they shut down was the print of the Jewish calendar. Right? They didn't want the Jews to have their own calendar. Right? That was something that bothered them more than synagogues and mikvahs and Jewish schools and whatever. Right? It was the calendar. Like going back to the story of Hanukkah as well. Right? The calendar, the Jewish calendar is something that bothered them the most. So we see there's very much significance to this idea of the calendar. Now, there's a lot of ideas behind the calendar. One of them, like I just mentioned, the fact that we as human beings have control over time, right? And we know that time isn't something that we live within time, but time is a creation itself. Time is something, right? The phenomenon of time, right? It's hard to really wrap our heads around what is time, right? The Torah tells us that time was a creation. God created the concept of time. God is above time, right? It's like what happened before the world was created. Before is already something in our reality. There's a before and there's an after. There's a present, there's a future, there's a past. But that phenomenon is a creation, right? It's hard for us to even imagine what it means beyond time. It's like a blind person trying to understand colors. What is time? Time is something God created. We're living within time. But time, the Kabbalah tells us, is something real. Every minute, there's something happening on a spiritual level. Kabbalah talks about the different energies that break down in every hour. If you ever saw a chart of different names of God, the way it's written, different formations of God's name, where every hour a different energy, a different light of God is shining during that hour. There's an interesting story that comes to my mind with the Alter Rebbe, who we just celebrated his yahrzeit on Friday. When he was imprisoned, story for itself. And while he was in prison, there was no clock on the wall in his cell. In fact, there was no window. So it was pitch dark, 24 hours. And what happens when you're sitting in a dark room for so long? You start losing track of time. Is it day? Is it night? You have no clue, right? And it's just, you're sleeping, you can't really sleep. I'm sure he didn't have a very comfortable bed. And most inmates just totally lost track of time. And they would play with him. So the prison guard comes into the Alter Rebbe, and it was in the middle of the night, middle of the day. And he says, "Why are you up? It's late at night, go to sleep." And the Alter Rebbe looks at him and says, "No, it's exactly," and he mentions the exact time to the minute. This is what time it is. And he says, "What? Like, how do you know that? You have a clock here? You have a watch?" Like he says, every hour a different name of God shines. So I'm in tune to that. So I know exactly what time it is. So it's real. There's some of us maybe could feel it. I think most of us don't, but time is a real thing, right? And we say this often, like when it comes to well, the Jewish holidays, right? Why is a Jewish holiday at a certain time? Not only because that's when it occurred, but it occurred at a certain time because the time was meant for it. Like, for example, why was Passover? Why did the exodus of Egypt happen on the 15th day of Nisan? Because from the beginning of creation, the 15th day of Nisan, that time was a time of freedom, for example. There's a certain type of energy of freedom that was already there, and therefore our freedom happened on that time. Right? Shabbos is not just the seventh day of the week. God rested on the seventh day, so we have to rest, and we just follow the calendar. There's a certain energy of rest, or whatever energy that Shabbos brings about, on that day, and therefore we rest. Therefore we keep Shabbos because of that time. And that's why we're so precise with like the minutes, right? I was just telling someone, one of the few movies that I watched is The Frisco Kid, right? The Frisco Kid, we had here a movie night like a number of years ago. So, Gene Wilder, exactly. So he's this rabbi going through America, traveling to the West, and everything that happens on the way. It's like a humorous movie a little bit. And there's one scene over there where it's like Shabbos, he doesn't travel, so he like he's on top of a mountain, whatever it is, and he's not traveling, and he's with a non-Jew, and they're kind of waiting to go, and he said, no, it's not Shabbos. So they're standing at like the edge of a cliff, and they're like, well, looking at the sun going down. And so it's okay, after sundown, we can start traveling again. So the guy's okay, it's basically not sundown yet. And they're waiting and they're waiting and waiting until, no, not yet, not yet, not yet. And then the moment that the sun goes behind the rocks, oh, now we can go, right? The point is, it's so precise. It's so precise. As they say with the Rogachover, one of the great Torah geniuses last generation, when he would like look at his clock as Shabbos was about to come in, and he would say, weekday, 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 holy, right? Kodesh. That moment, now it's a holy time, right? The moment that Shabbos begins, there's a certain energy of holiness in the air, right? So time is something real. So time is something real. Now, what's so amazing about the calendar? If time is something real, that something's happening during this moment, and we follow a monthly cycle of the moon, but who decides what day is the day on the calendar? It's the Jewish people. We decide, is today Rosh Chodesh? Is today the first day of the month? Or is tomorrow Rosh Chodesh? Right? It's based on, before the calendar, right? Originally how the system was set up, that we, the people, decide what day will be Rosh Chodesh. If we saw the new moon and we say Mekudash, today is sanctified, today is Rosh Chodesh. If we didn't see the new moon and we decide that tomorrow is going to be Rosh Chodesh, right? So which day will be Passover, for example, is dependent on us. Whether we sanctify the day or we don't sanctify the day. In fact, even if we did see the new moon, but for whatever reason we weren't able to get to the Beis Din on time and we missed it, then it's not Rosh Chodesh. It doesn't go about whether there was a birth of the new moon or not. It goes about whether the Beis Din announced that today is Rosh Chodesh. So we are deciding what day, for example, will be Passover. Is today the 15th day of the month or tomorrow is the 15th day of the month? And then we're telling you that time is something real. So we are deciding when this time should be in existence, right? Today or tomorrow. So we have a control over time. That's an amazing thing. That we control time. We control what day in the month it's going to be. And the day is something real. It's not arbitrary. That's an amazing power that God gave us. So that's one of the great significance of the calendar, that God tells us it's up to you. You are in control of the world. You are in control of this phenomenon of time, which is also obviously a very great responsibility, not to waste our time. But that's what we have. We have an edge over time. We are in control of, we decide when this time should come about. Should it be today or should it be tomorrow? When is, right? Control of the calendar. And to just add to that, the Sefornu, one of the commentators, his name was Rabbi Ovadia Sefornu, born in Italy in, I believe, like the 15th century or so. He wrote a commentary on the Torah. At one point, he was, I think, the rabbi, the chief rabbi of Rome, of Italy. And a very interesting commentary. He writes in this verse, the second half of the verse, it says, Rishon hu lachem. It should be the first to you. What's the emphasis? It's the first to you. So he says, now that you, that God says, now that you have become a nation, you have like a new existence, you have something new. Now God says, I'm giving you the idea of free choice. The idea of free choice. What's free choice have to do with the lunar calendar? What's the connection?
Oh, man, there's a lot. It's the moon cellularly and molecularly controls, like, the crime rate goes up on a full moon. Because 76% of your body's made of water, and the moon rises the tides in the ocean, and also rises the water level in your body, causes mood swings.
But Louis,
Everything is
you're saying the opposite of what I'm saying. You're saying that we don't have free choice.
But it's preordained.
Oh,
So your
preordained.
choice is
To pick the time. when
exactly.
It's sort of like the energy's going, just like you said, that like at a certain time of day, hour by hour, there's a certain energy.
Correct.
So
That's what I'm saying.
so God gives it to us to choose which energy you want to plug into.
Which is coincided with everything that's going on.
Yep. They say the story with during was one of the czars in Russia, where there was this terrible decree of the Kantonistim, right, where they would take the young Jewish children and draft them into the army for like 20 or 30 years. The idea was basically to tear them away from their Judaism. And a lot of these Kantonists that came out, or even while they were there, they had a very difficult time with their Judaism. So they were forced to eat non-kosher and forced to and basically drop all their Judaism. So a group of these Kantonists once came to one of the Chabad Rebbe's, the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe, and they said, well, what should we do? Like, we're forced to eat non-kosher. That's what they're serving, non-kosher meat. We're trying to keep kosher, but there's no way. We can't serve in the army and be strong and fast, right? So either we just fast, basically, and die, because there's no way we can do this alive, or we just eat the non-kosher food. Like, what should we do? That was their question to the Rebbe, right? So the Rebbe says, listen, in your situation, it's life or death, basically. So you're allowed to, or you should, eat the non-kosher meat. But, he says, don't lick your fingers. So what I'm saying is that things aren't, like Lewis is saying, many things are preordained. Preordained. Right, we say determined. What's it called? Determination. What's the theory called? Where everything is predetermined. If you speak to a good psychologist, they may be able to, a good psychologist that knows you well, they may be able to predict many of your free choices based on your past experience, based on your personality, and based on the way you think, based on all the outside influence that you had throughout your life. Everything is predetermined. Maybe AI will do a good job these days, that if you put your whole life into this, all your data, everything that ever went through your brain, into a AI system, and knowing you, right, like AI can know you, AI may be able to make the exact same choices that you are convinced that it's a totally free choice. I have a total choice to do A or B. I just chose to do A. But little do you know that it's really because of your whole past, right? Mind readers who do these shows, right? They'll tell you the same thing, that of course a mind reader is not a mind reader. A lot of it is sleight of hand. A lot of it is just like simple magician type of things. But a lot of it is psychology. A lot of it is that they know that if they ask the question in this certain way, or if 5 minutes ago they said one thing and then 5 minutes later they say something else, subconsciously it controls your mind to answer this exact way. I was once at a mind reader show where it was a Hanukkah event, and he comes onto the stage and he tells the rabbi, move the menorah over here. And he says, what's the problem? He says, everything that they see affects their mind. And I need to have the stage exactly as I need it in order to, I should understand their minds, right? So it's psychology. It's psychology, right? That a person that went through, if I went through everything that you went through and I had your personality, I would be making the same exact choices as you made because it's all predetermined. Now, that is a theory, whether it's true or not. That's a theory that everything is predetermined. It seems like we have free choice. Maybe the tide, and maybe the time of the month, and maybe everything else that affects my choices. So it's not really free choice. The Seforno says that the Torah is telling us that you have free choice. And the idea behind it that Chassidus explains is that although perhaps it is true that everything is predetermined, the beauty of this mitzvah is that we still have the ability to overcome that. And we do have true free choice. And that is the significance of the lunar calendar over the solar calendar, because the solar calendar is consistent. The sun's cycle is consistent. Every day it's the same thing. Rises in the east, it sets in the west. Daily cycle, 365 days a year. It's the same thing every day. The lunar calendar is very different. Beginning of the month, small moon. It gets bigger. 15th day of the month, it's a full moon. Then it gets smaller again. It grows. Every day the moon is a different size, right? Bigger, smaller. It's growing, it's falling, it's growing, it's falling, right? So in Kabbalah, we say that solar represents nature. Nature, it's consistent, right? What's a scientific theory? If you could redo it, if you could replicate it again and again and again, it's seems to be true, right? That's science. That's nature. Nature is consistent. If it's consistent, that's nature. The solar calendar represents nature, and nature, you could say, everything is predetermined.
But you just said that, you said that solar
Represents nature.
And you're saying the lunar represents nature.
I'm sorry, solar. Solar represents nature. And like we said, naturally, things are predetermined based on my nature, on my personality, on my experience, my way of thinking. I don't have true free choice. That's the solar calendar. That's the world around us. God tells us, I want you, for the Jewish people, I want you to count to the lunar calendar. I'm giving you free choice. Because just like the moon, which is inconsistent, which represents, according to Kabbalah, above nature, which is inconsistent, right? So that represents something higher than nature. You have the ability ultimately to break your nature, and you do have free choice. Even if you think it's predetermined, and it seems to be predetermined, you do have the ability to rise above it and make that choice, which is a beautiful thing, and it's a great responsibility, because we can never say, this is who I am, right? What should I do? This is who I am. God says, yes, this is who you are, but you have the ability to change. We all have the ability to say, yes, it's hard. Yes, it's against my nature. Yes, it's out of my comfort zone, but ultimately I have the ability to rise above it, to grow, which is really the idea of leaving Egypt, right? The idea of breaking our boundaries and living past that. So that is one of the reasons why the first mitzvah is the mitzvah of the lunar calendar, because it's so essential to what Judaism is all about. It's almost like essential as this, it comes in the middle of the story of the Exodus of Egypt, and why the Exodus of Egypt is so essential to Judaism, because this is what really life is all about. It's about growth. If you're growing, that's called living, right? And that is the ability that some argue that it's not possible, because I can't break my nature. And God says, yes, there is something called nature, and maybe things are predetermined, but ultimately, we do have the ability to grow. We do have the ability to break that and to change, even if sometimes it seems it's totally impossible. So that is a thought why it's so important to have this as our first mitzvah. I'll leave you with that. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning. Have a Shavua Tov, and hope to see you next week.
Rabbi, thank you. Wonderful.
Sorry, I went a little over time today.
No, it's good. I'm sorry I was late. I used the wrong code.
Thank you. Good to see you.